Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the true scary stories. Story 1. The Faceless. I laughed when the fortune teller said she'd removed the curse. It wasn't a joyful laugh, but a nervous, skeptical chuckle that barely masked the anxiety clawing at my insides. The small, cluttered room smelled of burning incense and something old, like forgotten memories left to decay. Madame Esmeralda, the fortune teller, watched me with eyes that seemed too deep for their sockets, as though they harbored secrets that shouldn't be spoken aloud. Her gnarled fingers hovered over the table, where a spread of tarot cards lay like a map to some dark, hidden truth. "You doubt me, Mr. Calhoun," she said, her voice thick with an accent I couldn't place. "But the spirits, they are not to be trifled with. The curse is old, older than you can imagine. I have done what I can, but you must be vigilant." I dismissed her words with a wave, trying to brush off the chill that crept up my spine. "I don't believe in curses," I replied, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. "I'm paying you for a service, and I expect results." She narrowed her eyes, the wrinkles on her face deepening like cracks in ancient stone. "You are a fool, Mr. Calhoun. A dangerous fool. The faceless ones will come for you if you are not careful. They hunger for what you have taken." Her words were nonsense, I told myself, but something in her tone made my heart skip a beat. The faceless ones? The phrase echoed in my mind, growing louder with each repetition until it drowned out all other thoughts. I wanted to ask what she meant, but the growing unease inside me kept my mouth shut. Instead, I stood up, placing a few crumpled bills on the table. "Thanks for the warning, but I'm not worried," I said, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. As I turned to leave, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. Her touch was icy, sending a jolt of fear through me. "They are already here," she whispered, her breath hot against my ear. "You can't see them yet, but they are watching, waiting. Be careful, Mr. Calhoun. They will take your face and leave you with nothing." I yanked my arm free and bolted out of the room, my laughter now a nervous tick that I couldn't control. The dimly lit hallway of the old building felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing closer with every step I took. By the time I reached the street, the laughter had turned into a desperate gasp for air. I stood there, panting under the flickering streetlights, trying to shake off the lingering fear. The night air was cool, a welcome relief against my burning skin, but something wasn't right. The street, usually bustling with life, was eerily quiet. No cars, no people, just me and the oppressive silence. I began walking, hoping the familiar sounds of the city would drown out Madame Esmeralda's words. But the silence followed me, growing heavier with each step. And then I saw them, a group of figures standing at the end of the street, motionless, like statues carved from shadow. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to see their faces, but there was nothing, just blank, featureless surfaces where eyes, noses, and mouths should have been. I blinked, and they were gone, leaving me alone in the dark. My heart raced, my mind struggling to make sense of what I'd seen. It had to be a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination twisted by fear. But deep down, I knew the truth. Madame Esmeralda had warned me, and I hadn't listened. The faceless ones were real, and they had started to follow me. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, those faceless figures standing at the edge of the darkness, waiting, watching. I tossed and turned, the sheets twisted around me like a straitjacket, trapping me in a growing sense of dread. My apartment, usually my sanctuary, now felt like a prison, the shadows in the corners growing thicker, more menacing. At around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep entirely. My nerves were shot, and the silence was unbearable. I flicked on the TV, hoping the noise would drown out the thoughts gnawing at my sanity. But even the bright flicker of the screen and the chatter of late-night talk shows couldn't banish the image of those featureless faces. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see them pressed against the glass, blank and lifeless. The phone rang, slicing through the stillness like a knife. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. Who could be calling at this hour? The thought of answering filled me with an irrational terror, but I couldn't ignore it. My hand trembled as I picked up the receiver. "Hello?" My voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. There was no answer, only a faint, raspy breathing on the other end. I froze, the receiver clutched tightly in my hand. I was about to hang up when a voice, soft and cold, spoke. "They're here." I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking uncontrollably. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. It had to be a prank, someone messing with me. But deep down, I knew better. The voice was too familiar, too close to the one that had whispered in my ear at Madame Esmeralda's. Desperation gnawed at me, and I grabbed my jacket, deciding that I needed to get out of the apartment, out of this nightmare. The walls were closing in, the darkness growing thicker by the second. I bolted out the door, not caring where I went as long as it was far away from those faceless horrors. The streets were deserted, the city eerily silent, as if the world had been drained of life. My footsteps echoed off the pavement, too loud in the empty night. Every shadow seemed to move, every corner a hiding place for those blank-faced figures. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see them lurking just out of sight. I walked for what felt like hours, the cold air biting at my skin, but no matter how far I went, the feeling of being watched never left me. It was as if they were there, just beyond the edge of my vision, following silently, waiting for the right moment to strike. I stumbled into an all-night diner, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow that did little to comfort me. I slid into a booth, my hands gripping the edge of the table. The waitress came over, her face tired and indifferent, and I ordered a coffee, anything to keep me awake and alert. The place was empty, save for a couple of truckers at the counter, their low murmurs the only sound besides the hum of the neon sign outside. The coffee arrived, steaming and bitter, but I barely tasted it. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, torn between the need to escape and the realization that there was nowhere to run. I could feel the eyes on me, the presence of something unnatural closing in. The door to the diner creaked open, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't want to look, didn't want to confirm what I already knew, but I couldn't help it. My gaze slowly lifted to the entrance, where the figure stood, bathed in the sickly glow of the diner's lights. It was one of them, faceless, its blank head turning slowly in my direction. The waitress walked right past it as if it didn't exist, her eyes never registering the horror standing in the doorway. I stared, frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. The figure began to move, stepping closer, each footfall echoing in my ears like a death knell. It reached out, an arm extending towards me, and I bolted from the booth, knocking over my coffee in the process. I ran for the back exit, my heart hammering in my chest, the sound of footsteps following me. They were coming, and there was no one left to believe me, no one left to help. I burst through the back door of the diner, stumbling into a narrow alleyway drenched in shadows. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of rotting garbage and something else, something acrid and metallic that turned my stomach. I didn't stop to think. I just ran, the cold air searing my lungs, the echo of footsteps growing louder behind me. I could feel them getting closer, their faceless gazes boring into my back, pushing me to run faster, further into the maze of darkened streets. Panic drove me deeper into the city, past empty storefronts and flickering streetlights. The night was a twisted labyrinth, each turn leading me further away from any semblance of safety. The sound of my heartbeat thundered in my ears, nearly drowning out the relentless footsteps that seemed to be drawing ever nearer. I darted into another alley, a dead end, but I was too frantic to notice until it was too late. The walls closed in around me, and I spun around, eyes wide with terror. They were there, emerging from the darkness like wraiths, their featureless faces devoid of emotion, of humanity. The faceless ones, just as Madame Esmeralda had warned, had found me. Their blank, pale heads turned in unison, focusing on me with a silent, predatory intent. I was trapped. I backed up against the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "What do you want?" I screamed, my voice cracking, desperate for any response. But there was nothing, only the sound of their silent approach, the whisper of their steps against the pavement. Suddenly, one of the figures reached out, its hands stretching impossibly long, fingers like tendrils of smoke reaching for my face. I tried to move, to scream, but my body was frozen in place, paralyzed by a fear that had seeped into my very bones. The figure's hand hovered inches from my face, and I could feel a coldness emanating from it, like the chill of death itself. Just as the icy fingers were about to touch my skin, a blinding flash of light erupted from behind me, reflecting off the damp walls of the alley. The faceless ones recoiled, their forms flickering and distorting in the sudden brightness. I turned my head, shielding my eyes, and saw the source of the light, a figure standing at the entrance to the alley, holding a lantern that glowed with an unnatural brilliance. The figure was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes that seemed out of place in the modern world. His face was stern, lined with age and experience, and his eyes were filled with a knowledge that sent a new wave of fear through me. "Get back," he commanded, his voice strong and unwavering. The faceless ones hissed, a sound like wind rushing through dead trees, before retreating into the shadows, their forms dissolving into the night. The man lowered the lantern, the light dimming to a soft glow, and approached me. I collapsed to my knees, the adrenaline that had kept me running finally giving way to exhaustion and terror. He knelt beside me, his gaze stern yet somehow comforting. "You're lucky I found you when I did," he said, his voice low and grave. "They were close to taking you." I could barely speak, my throat dry and raw. Who are you?" "Name's Gabriel," he replied, helping me to my feet. "I've been hunting those things for a long time. They've taken many faces, many souls." His words hit me like a sledgehammer. "Faces? You mean they steal them?" Gabriel interrupted, his expression grim. "They're collectors of sorts. They need faces to sustain themselves, to take on human form. Once they have yours, you're lost. Just an empty shell, wandering the darkness." I shuddered, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. "How do I stop them?" Gabriel's eyes met mine, filled with a sadness that spoke of countless battles fought and lost. "You don't. Not alone, anyway. But you can keep them at bay for a time." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small mirror, its surface worn and scratched. "Take this. It's not much, but it'll show you the truth. They can't hide from their own reflection." I took the mirror with trembling hands, staring at my reflection. My face looked back at me, pale and frightened, but intact. "What do I do now?" I asked, feeling a flicker of hope. "Stay in the light, always. Keep moving. And whatever you do, don't let them get close enough to touch you. They'll keep coming until they have what they want." Before I could ask more, a sudden gust of wind howled through the alley, extinguishing the lantern's glow. In the darkness, I could see them again, shadowy figures moving closer, their blank faces slowly forming into hideous mockeries of my own. Gabriel shoved me towards the street. "Run," he shouted, his voice breaking through the rising wind. "Run and don't look back." I didn't need to be told twice. Clutching the mirror, I turned and fled into the night, the faceless ones on my heels, their whispers growing louder with each step. I ran, my legs burning with every stride, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The city around me had become a labyrinth of darkness, the streetlights flickering and dying as I passed, as if the night itself was conspiring to help the faceless ones. Gabriel's warnings echoed in my mind, "Stay in the light, keep moving." But the light was fading, and the shadows were growing longer, more solid, like the fingers of some ancient, hungry beast. The mirror he'd given me was my only lifeline, clutched tightly in my hand as I sprinted down the desolate streets. I dared not look into it, afraid of what I might see reflected there. Instead, I focused on finding some place safe, some sanctuary where the faceless ones couldn't reach me. But the city felt different now, as though it had shifted while I wasn't looking, the familiar streets twisting into unfamiliar corridors that led nowhere. I turned a corner and found myself on a street that should have led to my apartment, but instead, it ended in a massive, wrought iron gate. The gate was old, rusted, and beyond it loomed an ancient building, its stone walls covered in ivy. A church, I realized, the stained glass windows dark and foreboding. The sight of it should have been a comfort, but instead, it filled me with dread. Still, I had no choice. I could hear them behind me, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. With trembling hands, I pushed open the gate and stumbled through, the heavy iron clanging shut behind me. The air inside the churchyard was thick, oppressive, as though the very atmosphere resisted my presence. But I pressed on, driven by fear, until I reached the massive wooden doors of the church. They creaked open as if by some unseen force, revealing a dark interior lit only by the faint glow of dying candles. The air was stale, filled with the scent of melted wax and dust. I stepped inside, the doors closing behind me with a heavy thud. The silence here was different, deeper, more profound, as though the world outside had been completely shut out. I was alone. Or so I thought. As I moved further into the church, the shadows seemed to shift, and from the darkness, they emerged, figures clad in old, tattered robes, their faces hidden by hoods. I froze, fear gripping my heart, but these weren't the faceless ones. They were something else, something older, something bound to this place. They moved silently, gliding across the stone floor, and as they drew closer, I could see the faint glimmer of faces beneath their hoods. But these faces were wrong, distorted, twisted, as if carved by a hand that didn't understand human features. I backed away, but they continued to advance, their voices rising in a low, chanting hum that vibrated through the air. I realized then that the church wasn't a sanctuary, it was a trap, a place where the faceless ones had brought their victims to be harvested. The twisted figures before me were their previous victims, left here to rot, their faces stolen and their souls trapped. Desperation clawed at my mind. I turned to run, but the doors wouldn't budge. I was locked in, surrounded by these grotesque remnants of humanity. The chanting grew louder, and I could feel a presence behind me, a cold breath on the back of my neck. Slowly, I turned, and there they were, the faceless ones, standing in a circle around me, their blank faces reflecting nothing but the darkness that consumed this place. Gabriel's words echoed in my mind, "They'll keep coming until they have what they want." And I knew now what that was. They wanted my face, my identity, my very essence. I raised the mirror, my hand shaking, and looked into it. The reflection that stared back wasn't my own. It was a face I didn't recognize, a twisted, tortured visage that seemed to scream silently. I dropped the mirror in horror, the glass shattering on the cold stone floor. The faceless ones moved closer, their forms shifting, melding together into a mass of darkness that blotted out the remaining light. The air grew colder, and I felt a pull, a force drawing me into the void they had become. I fought it, but it was no use. Their whispers filled my ears, promises of release, of becoming one with the darkness. My body began to numb, the fight draining out of me as the cold took over. I could feel my face, my very soul, being pulled from me, drawn into the abyss they created. In my final moments, as the darkness consumed me, I understood the truth. The faceless ones weren't just spirits or monsters. They were the void itself, the emptiness that waits for all of us, the loss of self, of identity. They were the end, the final veil that we all must pass through. And as the last remnants of my consciousness slipped away, I knew there was no escape. The curse was never lifted, and now, I was one of them. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Voice in the Dark. The phone rang late at night, its shrill tones slicing through the quiet of my small, dimly lit apartment. I wasn't expecting a call, especially at this hour. As I stared at the screen, the number was unfamiliar, yet something gnawed at the back of my mind. Despite the unease bubbling up inside me, I answered. "Hello?" My voice trembled slightly, betraying the apprehension I felt. For a moment, there was nothing but static on the other end, a low crackling hum that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And then, I heard it, a voice, soft and soothing, one I hadn't heard in over 30 years. It was my mother's voice, gentle and familiar, yet impossible. My heart stuttered in my chest. My mother had been mute since birth. She had never spoken a word. "Rebecca, my dear, how are you?" The voice was unmistakable, a sound I had only imagined in dreams, the one I had longed to hear throughout my childhood. There was no mistaking it, it was her, but it couldn't be. My mind raced, trying to piece together the impossible puzzle. Was this some kind of cruel joke? "And Mom?" I stammered, my voice cracking as I spoke. Silence met my question, followed by a soft chuckle, the same chuckle my mother would give when I was a child, whenever I got into mischief. It sent a shiver down my spine. The familiarity was unsettling, to say the least. This wasn't just someone mimicking her voice, it was as if she had truly spoken, despite the impossibility. "Don't be frightened, my sweet. I've always been with you," she said, her tone laced with a warmth that both comforted and terrified me. My hands shook as I gripped the phone tighter, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. It had to be a prank, or maybe I was dreaming. There was no other explanation. Yet, deep down, something primal whispered to me that this was real, too real. The connection cut off abruptly, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of my apartment. I dropped the phone, backing away from it as if it had burned me. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I couldn't shake the voice from my mind, the impossible voice of my mother that lingered like a ghost in the air. I wanted to believe it was just a bad dream, but I knew better. I could still feel her presence, her voice echoing in my mind, intertwining with my thoughts. In the days that followed, the voice returned, calling me at odd hours, always the same, always soothing, yet with an undercurrent of something darker, something that filled me with dread. Each time, she spoke as though nothing was amiss, as though she had always been able to speak. But I knew the truth, my mother had never uttered a word in her life. The mystery of the voice consumed me, and I began to lose myself in its pull, desperate for answers that I wasn't sure I wanted to find. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The voice on the phone had a strange effect on me, a mixture of dread and longing. Each time I heard it, I felt as though I was slipping further away from reality. I couldn't confide in anyone. How could I explain that I was receiving phone calls from a mother who had never spoken a word? People would think I was losing my mind, and maybe I was. The nights grew longer, each one darker than the last, the silence in my apartment heavier with every passing hour. One evening, I decided to visit my mother. She lived in the same old house I grew up in, a place that had always felt like a tomb. The air around it was thick with memories, the kind that clung to you like cobwebs. As I pulled up to the house, I noticed something unsettling. The windows were all dark, and there was an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I hadn't called ahead, but I knew she would be there. She was always there, living in that house, a relic of the past that refused to let go. I knocked on the door, my hand trembling as I did. There was no answer, but the door creaked open under my touch, revealing the dimly lit hallway beyond. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of old wood and dust. My footsteps echoed as I walked through the house, the floorboards creaking beneath me. I called out to her, but there was only silence. A deep, suffocating silence that pressed against my ears, making me feel as though I was underwater. I found her in the living room, sitting in her old armchair by the window. She was staring out into the darkness, her expression blank, as if she were lost in a world of her own. I approached her slowly, my heart pounding. "Mom?" I whispered, the word catching in my throat. She didn't respond, didn't even blink. It was as if she hadn't heard me at all. I knelt beside her, reaching out to touch her hand, but she remained still, unresponsive. And then, the phone in my pocket rang. The sound was deafening in the quiet house, and I fumbled to answer it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Rebecca, I'm so glad you're here," the voice on the other end said, soft and soothing, the same voice that had haunted me for days. My blood ran cold. I looked at my mother, her lips unmoving, her eyes vacant, but the voice on the phone continued, as if she were speaking directly to me. "It's been so long since we've talked like this," the voice said, a hint of sadness in it now. "I've missed you so much." I dropped the phone, the impact echoing in the silent room. The voice continued to speak, even as the phone lay on the floor, her words filling the room, wrapping around me like a shroud. I stumbled back, horror gripping me as I watched my mother, still silent, still motionless, but the voice, her voice, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Come closer, Rebecca," the voice urged, its tone shifting, becoming more insistent, more sinister. "Come to me, my dear." I ran from the house, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I reached my car, I could still hear the voice, faint and distant, calling my name. I slammed the door shut, locking myself in, but I couldn't escape it. The voice was inside me now, a part of me, echoing in my mind like a curse I couldn't break. I couldn't shake the voice from my mind. Even in the safety of my own apartment, it followed me, lingering in the corners of my thoughts, whispering in the dead of night. Sleep became a distant memory, each night filled with restless hours of pacing, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. I could feel something changing inside me, as if the voice was carving out a piece of me, replacing it with darkness. My apartment, once a refuge, now felt like a cage. Every creak, every shadow, seemed to pulse with an unseen presence. The phone calls grew more frequent, each one more unnerving than the last. My mother's voice, once soothing, now carried an edge that chilled me to the bone. She spoke of things I didn't understand, memories I couldn't recall, but which seemed to burrow into my mind like a parasite. It was as if she knew me better than I knew myself, as if she were drawing out something hidden deep within me. One night, as I sat in the darkness, the phone rang again. My hand hovered over it, dread curling in my stomach. But something compelled me to answer, a force stronger than fear. "Rebecca," the voice said, calm and familiar, yet laced with something sinister. "There's something you need to see. Come home." The words struck me like a physical blow, and before I knew it, I was out the door, the night air cold against my skin. The drive to my mother's house was a blur. The streets were empty, the town unnaturally quiet, as if the world had fallen into a deep, unnatural slumber. When I arrived, the house loomed before me, its darkened windows like hollow eyes watching my every move. I hesitated at the front door, my hand trembling on the doorknob. But the voice was inside me now, urging me forward, pulling me into the depths of the house. Inside, the house was as silent as a tomb. The air was thick, oppressive, making it hard to breathe. I called out for my mother, but only silence answered. I moved through the house, my footsteps echoing ominously, until I reached the basement door. It was slightly ajar, a cold draft seeping through the gap. I had always avoided the basement as a child. There was something about it that filled me with dread, a darkness that seemed to breathe and watch from the shadows. The voice whispered in my mind, urging me to descend the stairs. I flicked on the light, but it flickered weakly, barely illuminating the narrow steps. The air grew colder as I descended, the darkness pressing in around me. At the bottom, I saw the old rotary phone that had been there for years, dusty and forgotten. It was off the hook, the receiver hanging limply by its cord. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. It had never worked as long as I could remember. The basement was filled with old furniture covered in sheets, relics of a past that felt more like a dream than reality. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow, slithering between the stacks of boxes and old furniture. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The voice, my mother's voice, came again, but this time it wasn't through the phone, it was all around me, reverberating through the basement walls. "Rebecca," it hissed, now a low, guttural whisper, filled with malevolence. "You should never have come here." A figure stepped out of the shadows, and my blood ran cold. It was my mother, or rather, something that wore her face. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. She smiled at me, but there was nothing human in that smile. The creature before me was not my mother, but a twisted reflection, a dark echo of the woman I once knew. It raised a hand, reaching out for me, its fingers long and clawed, and I stumbled back, my mind screaming to flee. But my feet were rooted to the spot, the darkness wrapping around me like a vice. The voice grew louder, more insistent, as the creature moved closer, its eyes fixed on mine, hunger radiating from them. I could feel the walls closing in, the very air thickening with dread. The last thing I saw before the lights went out was the creature's face, twisted into a grotesque smile as it whispered, "You can never leave." Darkness swallowed me as the basement light flickered out, plunging the room into a suffocating void. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the faint sound of my own ragged breathing. My eyes struggled to adjust, but the darkness was absolute. I could feel the creature's presence, its cold breath on the back of my neck, its twisted form lurking just beyond my reach. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, desperate to find an escape. My hands fumbled for the stairs, for anything that might lead me out of the abyss. But as I moved, the voice returned, stronger and more malignant than before. It wasn't just in my head, it was all around me, filling the room, echoing off the walls in a cacophony of torment. "Rebecca," it crooned, the sweetness now gone, replaced by something darker, more insidious. "You belong to me now." My heart pounded in my chest, and I forced myself to take a step forward, then another, but each movement felt like wading through quicksand. The walls seemed to close in, the basement shrinking, trapping me in its clutches. I could feel the creature's gaze, burning into me, a predator toying with its prey. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness had consumed the house, twisting it into a labyrinth of nightmares. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a faint glimmer of light, a small, flickering flame that appeared to float in the air, like a distant candle in the blackness. Hope flared within me, and I stumbled toward it, my hands outstretched. But as I drew closer, the light began to change, warping into a figure, ghostly and ethereal. It was my mother, or at least the woman she had once been, before the darkness claimed her. She stood before me, her expression filled with sorrow, her eyes pleading. "Rebecca, you have to go," she whispered, her voice faint but urgent. "Leave this place. It's too late for me, but you can still escape." Her words were a lifeline, pulling me out of the pit of despair that threatened to consume me. But as I reached for her, she began to fade, the light dimming, the darkness reclaiming her. "No!" I screamed, but it was too late. The figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving me alone once more. Desperation clawed at me, and I turned to flee, my hands searching for the door, for anything that could lead me out. But the creature was faster. It lunged at me from the shadows, its twisted form appearing out of the darkness like a nightmare given flesh. Its clawed hands wrapped around my wrist, cold and unyielding, dragging me back into the abyss. The voice hissed in my ear, venomous and triumphant. "You can't leave, Rebecca. You're part of this now." The creature's grip tightened, pulling me closer, its face inches from mine. I could see the madness in its eyes, the hunger that drove it, and I knew then that there was no escape. The darkness wasn't just in the basement, it was inside me, a part of me. The phone calls, the voice, had all been leading to this moment, binding me to the house, to the thing that had taken my mother. The last of my strength ebbed away as the creature's grip pulled me into the darkness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, my voice lost to the void. The basement walls twisted around me, warping into a tunnel of shadows, dragging me deeper into the house's malevolent heart. As the darkness closed in, I felt myself fading, becoming one with the silence, a part of the house just as my mother had become. In the final moments, as the last shred of light disappeared, the voice whispered one final time, not in anger or triumph, but in a cold, chilling satisfaction. "Welcome home, Rebecca." The world dissolved into darkness, the silence absolute, and I was no more. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.